Singapore is one of the world's richest and safest nations. Yet it spends around 3.2% of its GDP on defense, a far larger share than much bigger countries like Japan, about 1.4%, or Australia, approximately 2.1%. Why does this tiny, peaceful city-state invest so heavily in its military? This video will explore the economics behind what some call the richest fortress, Singapore's high-tech, high-spending defense model, and its guiding philosophy as a poison shrimp. Singapore's heavy defense spending becomes clearer in light of its extreme geopolitical vulnerability. The nation consists of a mere 735 square kilometers of land, an island only about 50 kilometers east to west and 28 kilometers north to south. In other words, about as much strategic depth as a window ledge. Surrounded by the much larger Malaysia and Indonesia, Singapore has virtually no buffer zone. In World War II, the supposedly impregnable Fortress Singapore fell to invaders in just 1 week, a stark lesson in how quickly a small exposed territory can be overrun. Geography gives Singapore no room to retreat and few natural resources of its own. Moreover, Singapore sits at the maritime choke point of the Strait of Malacca, one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. The island's prosperity hinges on open trade routes, but that is a strategic double-edged sword. As a maritime city-state with little domestic food or energy production, Singapore must import essentials continuously. Nearly 90% of its food is imported, only about 14% comes from neighboring Malaysia, and much of its fuel arrives by sea. Cut off the food and the island starves. Cut off the oil and the island grinds to a halt, as one account bluntly notes. In short, any disruption to Singapore's supply lines or port access could be economically devastating. This precarious position at a global crossroads means Singapore cannot take its security for granted despite peaceful relations today. It's no surprise, then, that Singapore's founding leaders adopted a deterrence strategy suited to a small, resource-poor nation, the poison shrimp doctrine. Coined in the 1960s under Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew, the metaphor is that Singapore may be a small shrimp among regional whales, but any predator that tries to swallow it will be fatally poisoned. In practical terms, that meant building a military strong enough to make invasion extraordinarily costly for any larger neighbor. Lee Kuan Yew poured first-world technology and training into the armed forces from the country's early years, transforming Singapore into a formidable regional power, despite its size. One early partner in this effort was Israel, itself a small state facing hostile surroundings, which helped Singapore establish and train its military in the late 1960s. By deterrence through punishment, the poison shrimp ensured that while a big country could swallow Singapore, doing so would make the cost painful and possibly fatal. Over the decades, Singapore's defense posture evolved through what have been called the porcupine and dolphin phases, emphasizing more active forward defense and agile strike capabilities. But the underlying logic remains deterrence backed by advanced capabilities. Even today, Singapore's neighbors are vastly larger in population and land. Malaysia has 33 million people to Singapore's 5.6 million, Indonesia over 270 million. Yet Singapore's military has to convince any adversary that an attack would trigger a devastating response. This strategic need drives a high level of defense spending and preparedness, even in peacetime. Singapore's armed forces effectively serve as an insurance policy for national survival, paid for with a significant slice of the national wealth. One of the foundational pillars of Singapore's defense model is national service, NS, a mandatory conscription system for nearly all able-bodied 18-year-old males. On the surface, NS is about manpower. It ensures Singapore can field a sizable military despite its small citizen population. But NS also has a crucial economic dimension. It represents an implicit subsidy to defense in the form of extremely low-cost labor. Every year, thousands of young Singaporean men spend 2 years in uniform at nominal pay, providing the bulk of the armed forces personnel at a fraction of a professional soldier's market wage. How large is this conscription subsidy? Consider the numbers. Singapore's active duty force is about 51,000 strong, backed by over 300,000 reservists, thanks to NS. Each cohort sees roughly 25,000 male conscripts enlisted per year, meaning at any given time about 50,000 full-time NS conscripts are serving their 2-year stint. These citizen soldiers receive only a modest monthly allowance, around 1,060 Singapore dollars, about $814 for a new recruit, slightly higher as they advance in rank. That works out to roughly 630 million Singapore dollars per year in direct stipends for all conscripts combined. Yet the true economic value of this labor is far higher. If those 50,000 young men were working in the civilian economy instead, they would be contributing to Singapore's GDP. With a GDP per capita of about 100,000 Singapore dollars, that cohort might have generated on the order of 5 billion Singapore dollars in output annually. In effect, by conscripting them at token pay, the state redirects that potential productivity into national defence. One analysis pegs the total opportunity cost and labour value of the NS system at over 3 billion Singapore dollars per year. This massive difference, billions in labour value versus a few hundred million in allowances, is the economic cost borne by conscripts and their families, rather than by the government's payroll. It is like a huge in-kind subsidy that allows Singapore to maintain a much larger and more ready military than it could if it had to hire an all-volunteer force at market wages. To put it another way, Singapore's defence budget, officially around 15 to 20 billion Singapore dollars in recent years, does not fully reflect the manpower resources it enjoys. The conscription system supplies a large shadow budget of labour. For comparison, countries like Australia rely on fully professional volunteer militaries and pay accordingly. Australia's active force of roughly 58,000 costs the government many billions in salaries and benefits, contributing to a defence budget of around 50 billion Australian dollars, about 45 billion Singapore dollars, for 2023 to 2024, approximately 2% of GDP. Singapore's active force is about the same size, but much of it is made up of NS conscripts, making a tiny fraction of an Australian soldier's wage. The savings are absorbed by the state. In essence, Singapore has avoided the high labour costs that most advanced militaries incur by socialising those costs among its male citizens, who give up 2 prime working years and earnings. This conscription dividend is one reason the country can sustain defence spending above 3% of GDP without more severe strain. Conscript wages barely register in the government's ledger. Of course, this model has hidden costs: the loss of private sector experience for young men, gender inequity, as only males serve, and periodic disruption to careers due to reservist obligations. These are ongoing social debates in Singapore. But economically, there is no doubt NS provides a huge reservoir of low-cost manpower that anchors Singapore's defence capabilities. It is akin to a multi-billion-dollar annual subsidy that makes the overall defence system far more affordable than it looks at first glance. Singapore's leadership has long argued this is a necessary trade-off for security, given that a small country could not afford a fully professional force in its early years, and perhaps still cannot if it wants a force of current size and quality. In the words of Defence Minister Ng Eng Hen, peace must be purchased with a price, and NS has been part of that price since independence. The second pillar of Singapore's defence economics is a deliberate emphasis on capital-intensive, high-tech procurement. In other words, buying the best military equipment and technology to make each soldier, sailor, or pilot as effective as possible. If Pillar 1, NS, addresses quantity of manpower, Pillar 2 focuses on quality of capability. The logic is straightforward. As a small country with limited human resources, Singapore cannot win by sheer numbers. Instead, it invests heavily in force multipliers, advanced weapons, electronics, and platforms that give a small force outsized punch. This approach is sometimes summed up as maintaining a first-world military in a region where many others rely on older or less sophisticated kit. Examples of Singapore's high-tech procurement strategy abound. The Air Force, for instance, fields a fleet of top-end fighter jets. In the last decade, Singapore added 40 F-15SG Strike Eagle fighters to its arsenal, a variant of the American F-15 optimized with advanced radar and weapons. More recently, it set its sights on the 5th-generation F-35 stealth fighter. In 2020, Singapore ordered 4 F-35B Lightning II jets, the short takeoff vertical landing variant, in a deal worth an estimated $2.75 billion, and it has since exercised options to bring the planned F-35 fleet to 20 aircraft by 2030. This puts Singapore among a small elite of countries deploying the F-35, the world's most advanced fighter, underscoring a willingness to pay for cutting-edge tech. As Defense Minister Ng Eng Hen noted, the unit cost of the F-35A has now become comparable to Boeing's F-15, making it an opportune buy to put the Air Force in the Premier League of regional air power. By the end of this decade, Singapore will operate a mixed fleet of F-35s and upgraded F-15SGs, giving it arguably the most sophisticated air force in Southeast Asia. The Navy, similarly, has invested in top-tier hardware scaled to its needs. A prime example is submarines. Despite having a small navy, Singapore has acquired advanced undersea capabilities by purchasing German-made Type 218SG submarines, locally dubbed the Invincible class. The government ordered 4 of these custom-designed diesel-electric submarines from ThyssenKrupp Marine Systems, 2 in 2013 for about $1.36 billion, and 2 more in 2017. These 70-meter boats come equipped with air-independent propulsion, AIP, fuel cell systems, enabling prolonged submerged operations. For a nation reliant on sea lines, having a fleet of modern submarines is a powerful deterrent and intelligence tool. The first of the Invincible-class subs was launched in 2019 and delivered in 2022, with the rest by 2024. This leapfrogs Singapore's submarine capability ahead of many neighbours. It will have 8 submarines in total, including older Swedish refits, with some of the most advanced tech in the region. In effect, quality is compensating for quantity. A handful of high-tech subs gives Singapore disproportionate naval defence and possibly the ability to deny or disrupt maritime threats far from its shores. Singapore's Army, too, emphasises technology and precision. It has introduced Israeli-designed weapons and drones and modern armoured platforms. One telling fact: Singapore's Air Force and Army operate more advanced fighter jets and tanks than Malaysia and Indonesia combined, despite those countries' vastly larger populations. The armed forces field American AH-64 Apache attack helicopters, state-of-the-art Spider air defense systems from Israel's Rafael, and locally modernized Leopard 2 SG tanks, German Leopard 2s with improved armor and electronics. Singapore reportedly even employs cutting-edge cyber and intelligence tools. For instance, it has been widely speculated that Singapore is among the users of Israel's Pegasus spyware for national security purposes. All these investments create a military that punches above its weight class. The force multiplier philosophy is explicitly about efficiency, getting maximum defense output per soldier. Training is part of this as well. Singapore routinely sends its units to train with top militaries, e.g. flight training in the United States, Australia, and France, due to limited airspace at home. By integrating high-tech systems and intensive training, a small Singaporean unit can arguably achieve what would take a much larger, less equipped unit elsewhere. An illustration of this is Singapore's focus on networked warfare. Its command, control, communications, computers and intelligence (C4I) systems are highly advanced, linking soldiers, ships and planes in real time. This network-centric approach means better coordination and precision, further multiplying combat power. Importantly, Singapore can afford this arsenal because it sustains a high defense budget year after year. For decades, defense spending has hovered around 2 to 3% of GDP, and the government has steadily set aside funds for big-ticket modernizations. In fiscal year 2024, for example, the defense budget was proposed at 20.2 billion Singapore dollars, a hefty increase from 18 billion Singapore dollars the year before. This long-term financial commitment allows Singapore to upgrade platforms on schedule, such as replacing its F-16 fleet with F-35s by 2030, and to jump on advantageous buys. Ng Eng Hen described ordering additional F-35s as an opportunity buy, while prices are competitive. In short, capital-intensive defense spending is a deliberate strategy. By equipping its conscript-heavy military with world-class kit, Singapore achieves a level of deterrence and capability that far exceeds what its tiny population might suggest. The poison shrimp, to continue the metaphor, has procured some very sharp and shiny claws. This strategy does not go unnoticed. International security indexes rank Singapore's armed forces among the most technologically advanced in Asia. Regional neighbors are well aware that Singapore's F-15, F-35s, submarines, and guided munitions give it a qualitative edge. In fact, as noted in one analysis, Singapore maintains more advanced fighter jets than Malaysia and Indonesia together, and it has the capability to strike or defend effectively despite its size. Such strength, Singapore hopes, dissuades threats preemptively. No rival can be confident of a quick or easy victory, which is exactly the deterrent effect high-tech spending is meant to buy. Beyond conscripts and imported hardware, a third pillar supports Singapore's defence model, a robust domestic defence industry centred around the conglomerate ST Engineering, Singapore Technologies Engineering Limited. This homegrown industry not only reduces reliance on foreign arms, but also spins off economic benefits in the form of technology development, skilled jobs, and civilian applications. In effect, defence spending in Singapore has an industrial policy angle. It helps fuel high-tech industries that contribute to the broader economy, creating a virtuous cycle of growth and security. ST Engineering was founded over 50 years ago as a state-owned defence manufacturer. Its origins trace back to chartered industries of Singapore in the 1960s. Today, it is a publicly listed but government-linked corporation. Singapore's state investment arm remains the largest shareholder, around a 50% stake. Over the decades, ST Engineering grew into one of Asia's largest integrated defence and engineering groups, with 4 main divisions: aerospace, electronics, land systems, and marine. It produces a wide array of military equipment, from small arms to armoured vehicles to naval vessels, often in collaboration with international partners. For example, ST Engineering's Land Systems unit designed the SAR-21 assault rifle, the Singapore Armed Forces standard infantry weapon, and the Bionics infantry fighting vehicle. Its aerospace division has upgraded fighter jets and built parts for international aircraft programs. In short, the SAF gets a lot of its kit from ST Engineering or its subsidiaries, keeping procurement dollars onshore. The economic significance of this cannot be overstated. By investing defence funds in domestic R&D and production, Singapore ensures that some of the money cycles back into its own economy, paying local engineers, funding local innovation, and eventually producing products that can be exported for profit. ST Engineering has been quite successful on this front. According to its leadership, the company has implemented over 500 smart city and infrastructure projects in 70 cities worldwide using technologies originally honed in defence or dual-use contexts. These include solutions in smart mobility, transport systems, cybersecurity, autonomous robotics, and urban security systems. Essentially, ST Engineering leverages its defence know-how, sensors, command and control software, rugged hardware, to build civilian solutions for city governments and commercial clients. For instance, a command and control system developed for military operations might be adapted to manage urban rail networks or emergency response, and ST Engineering indeed provides integrated transport and surveillance systems to cities and airports globally. This dual-use focus is intentional. We have the advantage of leveraging know-how from either commercial or defence side to create dual-use technology, says Vincent Chong, ST Engineering's CEO. In a resource-scarce environment like Singapore, such cross-pollination is key. The same investment yields both security and economic returns. Innovations funded by defence, say a new radar or robotics platform, can spawn civilian products, like autonomous guided vehicles, drone services, or satellite tech. ST Engineering even runs a corporate venture arm and incubator to foster startups in areas like artificial intelligence, IoT, and green tech, acknowledging that integrating external innovations is crucial. Crucially, ST Engineering and similar firms allow Singapore to maintain a degree of self-sufficiency and resilience in defence. While Singapore still imports many big-ticket items, e.g. fighter jets, submarine hulls, it often customizes and integrates them locally. The Invincible-class submarines, for example, include combat systems jointly developed by Germany's Atlas Electronic and Singapore's ST Electronics. The Army's armoured vehicles and artillery are frequently either locally produced or co-developed, such as the Primus self-propelled howitzer or the Hunter armoured fighting vehicle, designed in Singapore. This means that in a crisis, Singapore has local industrial capacity to maintain and repair its equipment, as well as to produce munitions and supplies. Ammunition production has been a staple since the early days of chartered industries. The presence of a local defense industry is an economic asset in peacetime and a strategic asset in wartime. From a macroeconomic perspective, defense manufacturing and technology development contribute to Singapore's high-tech exports and GDP. ST Engineering alone had revenues around 10 billion Singapore dollars in 2023, nearly 70% from outside Singapore, making it a significant exporter. Its growth strategy explicitly aims for 2/3 of future revenue to come from overseas markets, driven by smart city solutions and defense exports. In other words, what started as a means to equip the SAF has grown into a global business line, supporting Singapore's reputation as a tech and innovation hub. The government's Smart Nation initiative dovetails with this, as ST Engineering is a key player in implementing domestic smart city projects, like the Punggol Digital District, which then become showcase products for export. Why maintain such high defense spending year after year? One way to view it is as a form of economic insurance. Singapore's leaders have often argued that a strong military guarantees the stability upon which the nation's prosperity is built. In a volatile region, credible defense deters aggression or coercion, thereby ensuring that businesses can operate and investments are safe. This creates what might be called a stability premium for Singapore's economy, an extra level of confidence that attracts global capital, corporations, and talent. Singapore's political and security environment is famously stable. There are no coups, internal strife, or insurgencies to threaten business operations, a rarity in Southeast Asia's past tumult. Part of this stability is due to effective governance and diplomacy, but underpinning it is the knowledge that Singapore can defend itself against external threats without having to rely on foreign powers. This self-reliance was emphasized by Ng Eng Hen in 2024 amid global tensions. If ever something similar to Ukraine happens to us here in Singapore, we do not plan on the basis that we can depend on another country to come to our rescue. By guaranteeing its own security, Singapore assures investors that there is an extremely low risk of disruption from war or conflict. In effect, the defense budget, large as it is, buys a form of nationwide risk insurance that enables economic activity to flourish. This is reflected in Singapore's standing as a global financial and commercial hub. It's not a coincidence that Singapore is sometimes called the Switzerland of Asia. Like Switzerland, it combines economic openness, banking secrecy, to a degree, and strict neutrality in foreign policy, but also bolsters that with a capable military. Switzerland famously has mandatory conscription too. The result is that Singapore is seen as a safe haven for assets and enterprises. Major international banks and multinational corporations choose Singapore for their Asia-Pacific headquarters, not only because of tax incentives or infrastructure, but also because they trust the rule of law and security to endure. Wealthy individuals from around the region, and increasingly the world, park their funds in Singaporean banks and trust its private wealth management industry, which now manages over 4 trillion Singapore dollars in assets, a trend accelerated by instability in places like Hong Kong. This influx of capital is partly due to Singapore's military shield that makes it one of the safest places, financially and physically, in a potentially unstable neighborhood. Defense spending thus underwrites key pillars of the economy: the massive port and logistics sector, the aviation and air hub, and Singapore's status as an international arbitration and business conference center. All these rely on the assumption of continued peace and security. For example, the Port of Singapore handles more than 37 million TEU of container throughput a year, facilitating trade equal to many times the country's GDP. It simply cannot afford a blockade or conflict in its vicinity. The Singapore Armed Forces contribute to securing vital sea lanes through patrols and cooperation in anti-piracy efforts, and in a crisis would be tasked with keeping the port and airport open. Likewise, Changi Airport's role as a global air hub, serving 68 million passengers pre-pandemic, depends on a stable regional airspace. Singapore's Air Force, with its advanced fighters and surveillance assets, helps maintain that. Even the day-to-day sense of safety, ultra-low crime, no terrorism, that makes Singapore attractive for expatriates and professionals is tied into its total defense philosophy, which integrates military, civil, economic, social, and digital security efforts. In financial terms, one could argue Singapore's defense spending, roughly 20 billion Singapore dollars annually, is small compared to what is at stake. The country's GDP is about $500 billion, and the wealth stored or managed in Singapore is several times that. A serious security crisis could wipe out decades of economic progress or cause capital flight overnight. Thus, dedicating approximately 3% of GDP to a military insurance policy is seen as prudent and necessary. As Lee Kuan Yew famously put it, "If you, Singapore, do not have a strong defense force, there is no economic future." This sentiment was echoed by Dr. Ng Eng Hen in 2023 when he noted Singapore has been willing to pay the price for peace by creating a strong military to ensure its economic future and security. In short, without a strong SAF, the rest of the Singapore story could unravel. There's also a less tangible but important economic benefit: investor and citizen confidence. The visible commitment to defense assures Singaporeans that their way of life is protected, which in turn maintains social stability and the willingness to invest in long-term projects. Foreign investors similarly perceive Singapore as a place where black swan events like wars are far less likely. This confidence can be seen in Singapore's AAA sovereign credit rating, one of the few in the world. Ratings agencies and bond investors take comfort in Singapore's strong reserves and governance, but also in its secure geopolitical footing. The Singapore dollar often behaves as a safe haven currency in times of regional uncertainty. During crises, it tends to hold value or even strengthen as capital seeks refuge. This flight to safety dynamic again mirrors how Switzerland is viewed in Europe. In essence, Singapore's military muscle buttresses its financial muscle. No strategy is without challenges. As Singapore's defense economy hybrid model faces the future, several risks and counterpoints have emerged in policy debates. Rising costs of advanced hardware. The very high-tech systems that give Singapore an edge are extremely expensive to procure and maintain. For instance, each F-35 stealth jet costs on the order of $100 million, and owning 20 of them means not just billions in acquisition cost, but also a steady outlay for operations, maintenance, and future upgrades. Similarly, cutting-edge submarines or missile defense systems constrain even Singapore's affluent budget. There is a constant arms race with technology obsolescence. Equipment has to be replaced or overhauled frequently to stay effective. As defense manufacturers roll out ever more sophisticated and costly generations of weapons, Singapore must carefully prioritize its purchases. The recent jump in defense budget, from 18 billion Singapore dollars to 20+ billion Singapore dollars in 1 year, partly reflects these big-ticket upgrades. While Singapore's economy has grown enough to accommodate such spending, there's always the trade-off of how else that money could be used: education, healthcare, etc. Defense inflation tends to outpace consumer inflation, meaning the SAF must spend more each year just to maintain the same capability. Over the long term, sustaining 3% of GDP on defense as GDP itself doubles or triples will be a hefty absolute cost. Policymakers will need to ensure the insurance remains worth the price. Demographic pressures on the NS model. Singapore's population is aging, and its birth rate is the lowest in the world, around 1.1 births per woman in recent years. This has direct implications for national service. Each year's pool of 18-year-olds is shrinking, which means fewer conscripts to fill the ranks. In the early decades, a growing population meant the SAF could also grow. Now, the trend may reverse. By the 2030s, there could simply be far fewer enlistments annually, potentially undermining the NS subsidy model. Singapore has so far been reluctant to conscript women, unlike Israel, one of its oft-compared peers. If the male population of service age declines sharply, the SAF might face a manpower crunch unless it either expands the eligible pool, for example, through female conscription or older volunteers, or restructures into a smaller, more professional force. Either path has economic ramifications. Conscripting women would impose the NS burden on the other half of the workforce, with significant opportunity costs and social impact, whereas shrinking the force or hiring more regular soldiers would increase budgetary cost or reduce capability. As the Vice article quipped, unless something changes, they will find themselves increasingly outnumbered in the years to come. Maintaining deterrence with a smaller population will likely require even greater reliance on technology, drones, automation, AI, to boost productivity per soldier. The SAF is indeed experimenting with such systems, for example, unmanned surveillance vehicles and robotic combat systems, but these too require investment. Regional arms race dynamics. Singapore's military supremacy in its immediate neighborhood has occasionally raised eyebrows. While Singapore itself portrays its posture as defensive, there is always the risk of security dilemma perceptions. Neighbors might feel compelled to upgrade their own forces in response, even if they have no hostile intent, leading to an arms build-up spiral in Southeast Asia. We have seen hints of this. For instance, Indonesia, historically a light spender on defense, approximately 0.7% of GDP, has announced plans to move toward 1.5% of GDP and made high-profile purchases like modern French Rafale fighter jets and Turkish Khan ballistic missiles. While Indonesia's pace is still modest compared to Singapore's, its recent acquisition of new missile capabilities was noted as giving it a domain, precision strike, that traditionally belonged to Singapore in ASEAN. Likewise, Malaysia has periodically fretted over Singapore's lead. For example, when Singapore acquired submarines in the 2000s, Malaysia soon bought submarines from France as well. There's a concern that if every country in the region ramps up military spending, it could heighten tensions or divert resources from development. Singapore treads a fine line. It wants to deter threats, not provoke an arms race. As of now, most ASEAN neighbors still spend far less, Malaysia approximately 1% of GDP, Indonesia less than 1%, Thailand approximately 1.3%. But great power competition, US-China rivalry, could inject new arms and alignments into the region, making it harder for Singapore to stay above fray. Indonesia's defense modernization lag also means Singapore's advantage might narrow if Indonesia decides to catch up rapidly. Singapore may then feel pressure to further enhance its own capabilities in response, a cycle that must be carefully managed via diplomacy and confidence building with neighbors.